I guess you just walk up like. So then we'll start off the question with letting you introduce yourself because now mine was super long. So
Cool. Milin Desai. I'm the CEO of Sentry. We help developers ship software faster, like every other company claims. But yeah, we help you ship software faster by helping you find issues in your software in real time. Prior to that, I was at a company called VMware, Riverbed, before that, and Veritas. So I was an ex-developer who's kind of moved on and got onto the dark side, which is the business side.
any of you use Sentry here? Like, does anyone use Sentry? There you go. So, okay.
Thank you.
So people know who you are. That's great. That's great. So today we're going to talk about open source. So Sentry also has an open source version of that. So when deciding to do, I won't even ask the question. I'll first let you tell your view on that. Why do companies, or why do you specifically offer your code as open source? So I'll let you take it off from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'll start with Sentry and kind of our thinking, and then we can back it up to the next startup that's coming and the decision you have to make. But at Sentry, it was fairly simple. This decision happened before my time, but the idea was to make software accessible and affordable. Those were the two principles. And so we always were kind of the belief that can we get this software in the hands of as many developers, irrespective of whether they paid or not, or even when they decided to kind of pay us, right? Can we start like a really low-level entry plan? So that was kind of the mindset. And over the course of the years, we evolved from being kind of fully open source to now we have a BSL license, which is still open source, where it's still all code available. You can still self-host it, but nobody can run it as a service. That's kind of the only change that we made. But we have customers who run the software on-premise, on their own, and it's the same software that we run in SaaS. So there are no differentiated features in our SaaS offering compared to the open source offering. So that's kind of one thing which is very different than typical kind of open source companies. But generally, like, everybody asks me this question, like, should I open source or not? And I think you have to start thinking of the idea of accessibility and affordability. How does this get in the hands of most people? It could be open source. It could just be a long extended trial, a limited license, whatever you want to call it, right? And then affordability is probably where everything kind of, from a business standpoint, becomes really interesting. And so I think from those angles, and is the core of your software? Is it all of the above? So it's a difficult, complicated question. But at Sentry, we said 100% open source in terms of being available to you, but you just can't run it as a service for others.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And I'm tinkering around with a little project, and I went into the depths of open source and licensing. And so I don't know how many of you have done that here, but that's really interesting. So you have on one hand, I'll just go through the extremes. On one hand, you have like the MIT and other very open, like you can take it, run, build on top of it, sell it, do whatever you want. And then you have the completely on the other side, like the ELv2 and whatnot, which is basically you can run this locally, but you cannot do anything with it, right? And so it's hard as someone trying to create a company, like as an entrepreneur, like you want it to be open source, you want people to build on it, but you also don't want someone like the hyperscalers to actually go out and kill your product. So you guys decided for something in between. And so also to give context, not just in between, but if you're doing something, there's two ways of in between, as I understand. So you have like GitLab, which has open core. And so then you have the core is open source under an MIT, and then you have to sort of remove the outer layers that you actually sell. And then you have something like you, which is a BSL license, which gives you the ability right away, and you give the whole thing, but it becomes open source later. Correct?
Yep.
So like, can you walk me sort of your sort of thoughts on that? And like, how does someone choose? I know what you chose, but like, in your sort of thoughts, like, why would someone choose something else? Or
yeah, it's in our case, it was very much like this general idea was Sentry was picking up steam in terms of kind of momentum. And it was this idea where folks just wanted to embed it in their kind of service. And as a result, that basically doesn't translate to anything back to kind of the core builders who are building that software. So for us, it was a very simple decision to go BSL and then fully open source kind of whatever we do, because the philosophy is still make it accessible completely and then protect yourself from kind of the folks who are trying to just take your stuff and embed it in their stuff and make money off of it. So we felt like this was a good ground between the two models. I don't want to comment on open core and other things because like we just don't follow that philosophy in that. But like in general, I would say like the one thing I would tell you as y'all are using software, if you use open source modules, figure out a way working with your company to pay back to the developers who are building it. So at Sentry, we have a program where for every developer, it's $2,000 per year that we'll donate to a community or a set of communities, and depending on what we use ourselves, of course, and then we have developers vote on like who they want to kind of donate the money to. So it's we have like 180 odd developers, so around $500,000 a year. We kind of give back to the individual maintainers of all the packages we use. And I think that's super important if you want to kind of keep open source alive and thriving, because those folks have to make money, and you shouldn't expect that for free. So I think giving back is a normal part and course. And I wish more people, even the ones like hyperscalers who take from a community, start figuring out a way to give back. And that would kind of solve a lot of the problems.
Absolutely. We've read stories about people and maintainers that have not been able to make, their rent or whatever, but they love their job. And so I've seen a lot of companies per developer that they do give back to certain open source projects, right? But I'm not sure, to your point, if the hyperscalers do that, because they are the ones that actually get the most value out of this as well.
I think it's starting to happen. I think it started with some of us, and now kind of word starts spreading, right? And like, can you contribute back? So it's starting to happen a lot more. If you're early in your company, I know we're all kind of strapped on funds, right? But eventually when you start seeing success, the idea of giving back is an easy one. And I think that's something we need to kind of persist and kind of strive to do as a group of developers and the community as a whole.
Absolutely. So like sort of shifting a bit, pricing and packaging as well. But before that, sort of like how do you, so you put something out there open source, like any advice on how to create a community actually around that? So it's not just sitting up there in GitHub, that actually do people use it?
Yeah, I mean, it's super hard, number one. So there's no easy formula, but does it bring value, right? The thing you build, if it brings value, users will come and use it. And the question is, how quickly can they get to value? And so a lot of folks now, when they build something, everybody says SaaS first, right? Like I need to build a service because that's how I quickly get to value. And you'll do all the stuff, onboarding and everything else. But then I turn on the service and it takes me a long time to get set up, and people get distracted because a lot of these things are kind of hobby projects that get started. So, time to value, the friction to remove that is super important. And they ask the question, am I just a library that everyone is going to use and, it's important, but it's not critical? Or am I something critical that will move the needle in terms of value? So I think that's where it comes to be. And then the community virality comes through developers talking to developers. There's no other magic to it. Honestly, there's no other magic to it. So somebody uses it, they love it, they give you feedback. The thing I tell, even this was most recent at Sentry, the thing I said is, when you get feedback, everybody, the number one thing you can do from your community is react to it. React to it does not mean you immediately go solve the bug, or just acknowledge it, process it, and then decide, do I have to fix it? Do I enhance the request and do something different? That is probably the number one way to kind of engage and build a community, is when somebody gives you feedback, good or bad, acknowledge it, figure out next steps. Sometimes it's not part of your plan, communicate it back. So, getting the community engaged in terms of technical articles, usability, responding to events, figuring out kind of where you fit in kind of the ecosystem. That's how I think you start building the community. There is no other magic to it. And then developers talking to developers. So,
No, I mean, developers talk, and I can pick people in this audience right now, like we in our company also use Sentry, and I remember that, and the first time I saw Sentry at a conference, I knew the company, even though I've never seen an ad or seen another booth or anything like that, right? So that's the developer talking. And so as someone that runs DevRel in general, the question is not that specifically, it's like, how much do you as a company, or you as a leader of your company, allow your people to invest in DevRel outside of actual DevRel? So like not hiring DevRel people, but like, communicating, like, because it's a very fuzzy number. You can't measure, like there's no way you would ever measure our company using Sentry because I have no idea who even told me about it, right?
Yep.
But I knew about it, so in that manner.
So 9 years in, so we just built a DevRel team, like last year. We've tried multiple times. So DevRel is not how necessarily we kind of got into the community. It is our developers. So even this year itself, we've said, can we be at more events? Can you present at more events? So it's not just the booth that you set up now that you can afford because you actually have some money, but it's actually presenting at events, right? So one common element as you are at your company is, how do I go out at conferences and share my story? It doesn't have to be about Sentry, by the way. It's about something you're building. That's how people, oh, this is what you do at Sentry. What does Sentry do
So
again?
you enable so just doubling down on that, like, is that something that you proactively tell people in your company, like, okay, it's okay for you to do that?
Yeah. Writing, writing technical articles, being on Discord, being at events is something we actively promote and we push for. And if you think about it, even the founder Kramer would tell you that's how he got to know a lot of the community by just being out there presenting at events, and that's how we became what we became. So active participation of every individual member of the company moves the needle. And to this day, we kind of say that, right? So most recently, one of the interesting changes we did was all of our kind of building is now on GitHub. So all our kind of product issues are now on GitHub. And so we are asking, so when you want to comment on an issue, you can just go there and comment, and developers actually engage.
So everything is transparent and public.
Correct. Right? But it does, to your direct point, you could spend money on like DevRel and other things, which absolutely is needed, but there is nothing better than your own developers talking about how they build, how they operate, not necessarily about Sentry itself, but even other things they use to other folks. And through that, it creates engagement and dialogue.
Absolutely. And so how much is the ability to have it open source enable that? Like, how much has it helped it, do you think? Like, if you remove the open source part, like, what change would you feel happen?
I think being open source is a mindset, and that has definitely helped attract the right talent. So I do ask folks who join the company, say, like, hey, what is kind of interesting? And they're like, the work I'll do, it's all out there. I can showcase it. The other thing they like is the scale. Like, they make a change and it goes to like millions of developers. And so that definitely helps in recruiting in that. And then from a community standpoint, we've heard from a lot of folks who've said, being open source, we know that, like, hey, I can run it myself. I can contribute to it if I need to contribute to it. And so the answer on that is yes, it does help. It does help a lot, and it does contribute a lot. Now, all the other tactics can still be done without a company being open source, like having all your issues on GitHub and driving that. But it's not the same if if your code is still closed source, then it doesn't really matter. It's just a discussion forum, whether it's GitHub issues or something else. So.
I actually have a personal question that came up, personal interest question. And so, like, I'm jumping you with this one. And that is there, and I have a specific sub-question, is there a negative aspect to having your code completely open versus proprietary, in the sense of velocity of change that allows you to do inside your code base? So for an example, because everything's open source, you can't turn a hard left. Like, it's very hard to turn a hard left with something. So have you ever thought about it? If you haven't, it's fine. I'm just really interested personally about that.
At Sentry, we've not experienced that because a lot of kind of the core developers are at the company or around the company. So we are kind of like a unit operating it. It can get difficult if the majority of contributions are from the outside, right? So in that, but increasingly, like, by building in the open, it's not been an issue, number one. So I think the challenges of doing that are when a lot of the alternate solutions are actually closed source. And so recently we've seen where those solutions have taken some of the work we've done and kind of used it, but without attribution. Just attribute it, no big deal, right? So that's kind of the only thing I sometimes think about. I'm like, the velocity of innovation can sometimes be caught up, but that's the beauty of open source. It keeps pushing you to develop. But no, I would say it's
Got it. And a sub question to that. So you have a huge client, and like a huge client wants you to create some sort of feature, and obviously that feature now has to go to the rest of the community, but maybe the majority doesn't want it, or it's a different direction. How do you decide on that? So like, you have a big check in front of you, Like, will you do it? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that is very easy to answer. At Sentry, I don't know non-Sentry scenarios, but we typically will never build for a few. We build for the many. So we've had instances at the company where somebody's come and said, "Here's a check, go build this for us," and we've said no. Because it did not kind of fit into what we wanted to do. It didn't fit in the general direction of the entire developer community. And so for us, that decision process is fairly simple, and we've not had to make that pivot necessarily in that, because it's actually one of the Sentry operating principles that obsess about the customer, and then it says, we build for the many, not for the few. And so it allows us to kind of do that consistently. So at Sentry, it's fairly easy. At a larger company, that's where the open core versus open core model probably works better, because you're open core and then you can build a module that you can charge for. And so I think that's where that model fits really nicely.
Okay. And on that, sort of, how do you think about pricing and packaging for this then type of product? So you have a open source completely, everything's there, you can try it, run it. And so how do you then think about pricing and packaging as a business now selling your product?
I mean, if I had one thing to say, even as a developer, as you're building things, and especially folks who are early into their entrepreneurship, packaging is probably one of the things you want to spend a lot of time in. So everybody thinks about pricing, right? But how you package your product is super important.
Can you elaborate on packaging? Like, can you go a little bit deeper?
Yeah,
on that?
so it's like what set of functionality or features make like tier 1 versus what can I charge tier 2, which is slightly higher. And everybody focuses on price, but if you get the packaging right, you can always change price. Changing packaging is much harder, right? Because you're like, oh, this feature now went from, I want to charge more for it, but I've already given it away, right? Versus if you create the right packages, which is what's the entry level value, what's kind of the next level up, what's the third level up, right? Typically 3 tiers is what people recommend, because there's some pricing jujitsu about it. But in general, what I would say is focus on packaging, which is what is the minimal kind of set of capabilities that you can drive maximum value, and then you get the price point on that. And so I think like packaging and pricing is super important for any business. As developers, as entrepreneurs, you should think about it. You'll say, why should I think about it as a developer? Because if you build something and you're like, everybody should have it, and it is something that is kind of an everyday thing, then it goes into your base plan. Or you believe that it is something that's more of a premium element yourself, right, as a builder, then you can actually kind of price differently, package it differently in a higher tier. So I think packaging is something that people don't think about. Pricing is a lot of folks spend time on. Spend how you want to kind of set your features right, and then pricing is something you can adjust. You can start high, kind of go low in that element. So.
Yeah, makes sense. Sort of like, I think it's wrapping. Well, yeah, we're almost at the end. So sort of like one question that also interests me, hopefully interests other people. The majority that I've seen of companies that have an open source segment of it usually start as an open source product and then someone commercializes it afterwards, post. Was that the case with Sentry or no?
Yeah, it was always open source.
Yeah.
And then folks started paying us, and then, yeah, that's how it happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in a sense, like the vast majority of that, but what are your thoughts on companies that are closed, that are like, oh, okay, maybe it makes sense to do open source? Like, should they do it? Yes or no? Anything to think about before they do that? Is there anything sort of like issue to do it the other way around versus going out directly for that?
I've seen a lot of companies lately do that, which is they start with like, hey, this is what we've built, and then they choose to either entirely open source the entire project or a piece of the kind of core IP to the community to get the kind of community engagement that we talked about earlier. So, you can always do it later, but this comes back to how are you building your business? Because if you start with open source and you get that virality, then it's much easier to go to the community and charge and upcharge. The other thing you could say is, oh, I've started making money, now I'll open source it. And so it all depends on kind of what business you're in, who are you targeting as a persona, what's working in that regard. But there is no element of like you have to be open source from day zero necessarily. You can always change your mind a little bit, as long as you're headed in that direction of transparency and being open.
Absolutely. So in the sum of this is definitely open source. Everything that you do, that's it.
Yes.
Figure out the license, but open source it for sure. Yeah, I think we're about time. So Milin, thank you very much for joining us, coming out to Miami, and I hope you enjoy the day. If anyone has any questions, you'll be around still today, yes?
Yeah.
So we're going to go grab lunch, and so if anyone's hungry, you can also grab them by the shirt and ask any questions you have. So thank you very much. You've been awesome.
Thank you for having me.